Good evening and welcome. I'm Bradley Graham, co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and on behalf of everybody here at PNP, thank you very much for coming. We will try to get through tonight and get you home in time to watch The Last Word this evening. I'll tell you a secret, the show hasn't yet been written, so it's very important that we end on time. We're delighted to have Lawrence O'Donnell with us this evening to talk about his new book, Playing with Fire. Lawrence has had several interesting careers. Back in the late 1970s and into the 80s, he was a writer. His first book, Deadly Force, about a case of wrongful death and police brutality, in which Lawrence's father was the plaintiff's lawyer, even was made into a movie, and Lawrence just told me it's actually going to be reissued soon. So if you don't have a copy, you can look forward to that. It's called Deadly Force. Then in the late 1980s, Lawrence got into politics for a time, working for Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and then as staff director of the Senate's Environment and Public Works Committee, and later the Finance Committee. After that, he found his way into TV, writing for or producing episodes of The West Wing, and winning an Emmy in the process. He also was involved with a couple of other TV dramas, including First Monday and Mr. Sterling, and along the way he did some acting on some shows. I mentioned that Lawrence won an Emmy for his work on The West Wing. Well, that was the last thing he won until earlier this week, when on Colbert he made it into the Trump Attacked Me on Twitter Hall of Fame. And if you haven't seen a clip of it yet, Lawrence delivered a very moving acceptance speech. He was obviously very touched by the honor. Anyway, Lawrence has spent much of the past decade appearing on TV as his opinionated self, discussing the news and tackling issues of the day, initially in the shadow of Joe Scarborough and Keith Olbermann, but since 2010 as host of his own show, The Last Word, on MSNBC. Now, somehow rather amazingly, given his packed schedule, Lawrence has managed to return to book writing and churn out more than 400 pages about one of the most transformational political events in the 20th century, the 1968 election. Lawrence himself was in high school at the time, but he was certainly old enough to have been forever affected, as so many of us from that tumultuous period were, by all that transpired. The year 1968 included President Johnson's extraordinary decision not to run for another term, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, the violent Democratic Convention in Chicago, and bitter nomination fights in both parties, all set against the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. It seemed back then that America's politics were hopelessly splintered and that the United States was coming apart, perhaps more so, or in different ways at least, than now. With vivid detail and seasoned insight, Lawrence looks back at what made the 1968 election a watershed event. Please join me in welcoming Lawrence O'Donnell.
Thank you very much. I'm standing room only. This is amazing. I can't believe it. But it makes me feel bad, so I'm gonna be quicker because you're standing back there, and you're gonna get bored much quicker standing than these people will. Yeah, I have to do a live TV show in a little over 3 hours, and tonight, just tonight. Don't judge tonight's show, okay? It's going to be written in about 8 minutes. It'll be something off the top of my head, and but you know, the great thing tonight, and the unfortunate thing tonight, is that I won't be compared instantly to Rachel's greatness because she has the night off, and there's one of those Richard Engel specials in there, and so, you know, it won't look quite as starkly unprepared as it actually is. But, you know, I mean, I couldn't be luckier to have her there in front of me, because those, what I've stretched sometimes out to be 4 and even 5 minutes, to the great anxiety of the control rooms involved, those minutes that I get to talk to Rachel every night, when she says good evening, those are my favorite minutes of the day. They are my favorite minutes of the day, and they always have them budgeted. The control rooms have it budgeted for 1 minute. And you can see what's going on there. That's just me in a late night phone call, desperately trying to keep her on the phone. Don't hang up. And then she does, and I have to go do the show. I couldn't be lucky to have her. She's setting new records in cable news ratings this year. And so she's our #1 show. She's frequently the #1 show in all of cable news. And I then get to be the #2 show at MSNBC. And I believe I've been asking, can we change the name of the show and actually just present it accurately for what it really is, which is riding the Rachel wave with Lawrence O'Donnell. That's the show. That's what it is. You don't have to choose. Come on, cut it out. This 1968 election was the first one that I was alert for. I was in high school. I remember 0 of the 1964 election, just the one right before that. I remember just flashes of 1960 because it was a giant deal for, Irish Catholic boys in Boston that one of us was on his way to winning it. And it's hard to believe this now, but in those days we lived under a certain kind of, old ghetto culture notion that it couldn't happen, that they could not elect a Catholic president of the United States. And if you know our political history for the decades preceding that with Al Smith and others, there was evidence that you couldn't elect a Catholic. And that was all transcended and exploded in one night in November in 1960. And so the world we were looking at in 1968, when I could finally really pay attention to what this was a world coming apart in the United States. The Vietnam War is raging, and we had an incumbent president, Lyndon Johnson, who had been elected 4 years ago in a landslide, who was obviously, according to the political arithmetic of the time, on the way to an easy and overwhelming re-election again. And he was very likely, it seemed, to be facing someone who was very good at losing presidential elections, Richard Nixon, who had the distinction in history at the beginning of 1968 of being the very first vice president in history to lose a presidential campaign. And he then made Hubert Humphrey the second in 1968. But as the year began, it was back in that ancient America when if someone said, I'm a Democrat or a Republican, you didn't know. Is that person a liberal or is that person a conservative? Liberal Republicans were among the front runners for the Republican nomination at the beginning of the year, George Romney and Nelson Rockefeller. And there were still plenty of conservative Democrats, and the United States Senate was filled with conservative Democratic senators from the South. And 1968 was the year where the real divisions between the parties that we see now were first locked in cement. And we saw, and it's one of the more poignant scenes in this book, what literally became the last liberal standing on a Republican convention stage in 1968. And it was the moment when Mayor John Lindsay of New York was forced, at least half against his will, to second the nomination of Spiro Agnew to be Vice President of the United States after Lindsay himself wanted to get that nomination. He then had to second that nomination for Agnew, and that was the last time a national Republican of significance stood on a Republican convention stage as a liberal. And John Lindsay eventually left the Republican Party not long after 1968. And so we now have a world in which when people hear that you're a Democrat or they hear that you're a Republican, they think they know everything about you. It's not just that they know that whether you're a liberal or conservative. They think that they know everything. And 1968 had more drama and chaos and utter madness in it as a presidential campaign than anything we had seen before. And what we just saw in 2016 was, in fact, a perfectly normal, standard presidential campaign, with the exception of one eccentric candidate. Okay? But if you look at every other moving part of that campaign, it was all operating according to the way it always has. And in the Democratic side, what we were seeing was a rerun of 1968, which was the liberal insurgency from the left, which starts at about 3% in the polls, challenges the overwhelmingly establishment favorite of the Democratic Party, in this case Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders. And that insurgent candidacy rockets up from 3% and becomes a very real challenge and wins a bunch of states. That was exactly what we saw happen in 1968 when Gene McCarthy made this historic decision, without which this would be a very different and very much thinner book. Gene McCarthy made the decision that changed history that year. He decided to challenge an incumbent president. We'd never seen that before. Bobby Kennedy had thought about it before McCarthy, which is something I didn't know before I got into this book. He actually thought about it, decided not to do it, thought about it again, decided not to do it. Then Gene did it, and then Gene won New Hampshire, and then Bobby decided to get in. I didn't know, it was decades after 1968 when I first learned that Gene McCarthy actually came in second in New Hampshire. But for a high school kid consuming the news, it felt like he won New Hampshire. But the news was he did so shockingly well in New Hampshire, coming in a close second, that all of the calculus was upset from that moment forward. And that changed everything. And every what if that you can come up with 1968 begins with what if Gene McCarthy had not run. Because if Gene McCarthy had not run, then everything else means nothing. We would have had Johnson versus Nixon. The likelihood is Johnson would have won that race, but as we know, the outcome in terms of the issue of the day, which is the war, would not have made any difference which one of them won that race. This is not just a history book. It's an eyewitness account in many sections of this book. I don't always identify the eyewitness accounts. For example, I was sitting on the floor at home, and my parents and my older brothers were sitting in the chairs around me as we were watching the Democratic Convention and watching the rioting in the streets in Chicago. I was watching that. So some of these accounts in here are things that I saw with my own eyes, and it's a combination of looking at the research material for it and remembering what I saw. And the thing I can never forget from that convention was the moment when the mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley, who was really running that convention, is standing and yelling anti-Semitic profane slurs at Senator Abraham Ribicoff because Abe Ribicoff stood up at that podium at the convention to nominate George McGovern and said if George McGovern were president today, we would not see this Gestapo behavior in the streets of Chicago. And that set off Richard Daley. And I could read his lips. I know what those words were that he was saying. And for anyone who could not read his lips, within an hour, the networks actually had lip readers on telling you what Richard Daley had just said. The Richard Daley moment at the Chicago convention would have been the most dramatic convention moment of any other convention in our lifetimes. Just that one Richard Daley moment. It is but a moment in a week that was just a stunningly out of control week for America's political system, which believes that everything must be controlled. I want to read you a passage or two from this book. And yesterday I was in Harvard Square, and I was doing one of these appearances there, and I had with me this wonderful guide who basically guides people through book tour stuff, and this is what she does in Boston. And so I asked her advice about how to handle these things, and And one of the things I asked was, what about readings from the book? And she said, well, with nonfiction, you don't really want to do that. And I said, okay, well, I don't have enough material if I can't read from the book. And so I violated the rule, and I reached for the book. Because what I want you to get the feel of, for people who haven't gotten the chance to get the start with this book, is that there are some very personal observations. There's some very personal experience that goes into living through 1968 and life in 1968. And I want to give you just a bit of that, and I want to get to your questions as fast as possible, because in this room, I've got a room full of people who are smarter than me, and I'd like to learn some stuff that I might be able to steal and use on TV, okay? So 1967 is the year Bobby spends thinking about running for president and deciding against it, and everywhere he goes, whenever he gives a speech anywhere, all he hears is "Run, Bobby, run. Run, Bobby, run." That's all he hears is "Run, Bobby, run." And this part of the story picks up in that spot. Underlying Bobby's speeches was a force we had never seen before in American politics, something we've never seen since, something Shakespearean. When Bobby stepped up to a microphone, no matter how sunny the day, no matter how wide his smile, he was always framed in tragedy. The personal and national tragedy of the assassination of his older brother, the President of the United States, on November 22nd, 1963, in Dallas. Bobby's audiences knew his pain because they all felt their own version of that pain on that horrendous day in 1963 that shook the country to the core. In Kennedy's hometown of Boston, it felt as if the world stopped. I was in St. Brendan's Elementary School in Boston when the nuns got the news that the president had been killed, the first Catholic president, something the older nuns never expected to see. Now they had outlived the 46-year-old Irish Catholic boy who had made them so proud. The Sisters of St. Joseph were the strongest women I knew, but this was too much for them to bear. They simply couldn't carry on. They closed school early and sent us home. We had never seen them cry before. We were all crying when the nuns got us into our lines to march us out to the sidewalk. Everyone we saw was crying. Every driver stopped at every traffic light. Men carrying tool bags were crying. Men carrying briefcases were crying. Boston cops were crying. Subway cars were filled with people crying who had left work early to go home and cry with their families and to watch the Kennedy family's ordeal unfold on TV. We watched Bobby holding his brother's widow's hand that night when she arrived back in Washington, still wearing her pink blood-stained clothes. We watched him holding her hand at Arlington National Cemetery. Nothing could ever happen in this world to make us forget those images, which were only 4 years old in 1967. When Bobby's audiences started chanting, "Run, Bobby, run." Bobby had a movie star's smile, but when he smiled, his audiences believed they were seeing a grieving man who was somehow strong enough to smile through his pain. Bobby was the only politician whose smile could make people's eyes tear. And with those tears in their eyes, when they looked up at Robert Francis Kennedy, they were always seeing John Fitzgerald Kennedy. For them, justice demanded that RFK take JFK's seat behind the desk in the Oval Office. History demanded it. No other politician in our history ever had such an advantage or such a burden. There's a part of this book where we go into great detail about the decision that Bobby was going through, the how to decide this. And it's fascinating who was in favor of it and who was against it. His wife Ethel was in favor of it. Jackie Kennedy, then still Kennedy, was in favor of it. Although Jackie, when he finally did decide to do it, did privately tell someone that she believed this would end for Bobby the same way it ended for Jack. The assassination cloud was in Bobby's head all the time as he was trying to make this decision. And also there was just the tactics of it. There was just, this has never been done before, this is crazy, I can't win. And no one was sharper about that than Bobby. Gene McCarthy knew nothing about running for president, nothing. And that may have enabled him to run for president. Bobby knew too much. Bobby was a realist first, a politician second, and a dreamer third. When he heard his audiences urging him to run for president, he knew he was hearing dreamers. Their dream was not so much another Kennedy presidency as it was a restoration of the first Kennedy presidency. They wanted to put their shattered dream back together. Bobby knew what they wanted was impossible, crazy, maybe even political suicide. Running against the incumbent president for the nomination of his own party was madness. Running against Lyndon Johnson for the nomination that he owned was something more than madness. Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, the most ruthless Democrat and the most ruthless Republican, feared that dream of a Kennedy presidency, as did all the other Republican presidential hopefuls. And Bobby didn't think a dream was enough to run a presidential campaign. Bobby was almost certain that challenging Johnson was hopeless, but it might be the only way to put pressure on the president to de-escalate the Vietnam War. The chance, the dream, the war, and anti-war Democrats privately urging him to do it, all contrived to get Bobby thinking about it. It was a rerun of the way he approached running for the Senate 3 years earlier. At first he resisted, then he wavered, then he resisted again, then he wavered again. All the while, Johnson and Nixon and the others believed that Bobby held history in his hands. Bobby did not yet realize that the 1968 presidential election would be about nothing less than life and death. In the nuclear age, all presidential elections were, by implication at least, about life and death, because the commander-in-chief had the power to start World War III in minutes by launching nuclear missiles. But the 1968 election was going to be about the life and death of people we knew. In the spring of 1968, my cousin John T. Corley Jr. graduated from West Point, then visited us in Boston before he shipped out to Vietnam. Johnny was the tallest among us, 6 feet 4 inches, a West Point football star. We worried that he would be an easy target in Vietnam. Johnny wasn't worried. He grew up on Army bases with his father, a general, and was trained for combat and eager to try to rival his father's World War II and Korean War records, which filled their home with 26 awards and combat decorations, including a record-setting 8 Silver Stars. My oldest brother, Michael, showed Johnny his draft notice, which had just arrived in the mail. Michael was worried. He didn't want to go to Vietnam. No one we knew wanted to go, except Johnny. He wanted a career in the military like his father, and combat was part of that. Johnny advised Michael that the best way to avoid Vietnam might be to voluntarily enlist before being drafted, because then he might get a better choice of assignments. Getting drafted was the fastest route to Vietnam. Michael took Johnny's advice, enlisted, got easy assignments in the Army, and never left the United States. Johnny arrived in Vietnam on May 9, 1968. Over the course of that summer, his letters to Michael began to question the wisdom of the mission in Vietnam. Johnny earned a Silver Star in 4 months on September 8, 1968, the day he was killed in action. His funeral was the first military funeral I attended. Tragedy has many faces, but none quite like a general crying, saluting his son's coffin. It was just another day in the life of America. In 1968, the presidential election could end all that if Bobby ran on ending the war in Vietnam and won, as anti-war Democrats were assuring him he could. I was in high school in 1968, and I never heard my brothers and their college-age friends talk about career planning. They only talked about how to deal with the draft and Vietnam. There was no long-term planning, no career hopes and dreams. Life was a short-term game for many young men in 1968. It was as if they were prisoners who could only begin to think about life on the outside when they were outside. Their prison was in their pocket, the draft registration card that controlled their lives. and blocked their hopes and dreams. The presidential election could end all that. The presidential election was a matter of life and death for real people we all knew. That meant that this time running for president didn't have to be about ego. It meant that running for president couldn't simply be a matter of political calculation. It meant that it wasn't just about what was best for Bobby's future in politics. It was about life and death. The death Bobby thought about was his own. He worried that announcing his candidacy might tempt an assassin. He knew assassination was driven more by madness than logic, and maybe getting the second Kennedy on his way to the presidency would capture an assassin's twisted imagination. He was the only potential candidate who had to worry about a copycat assassin going for another Kennedy. And so Bobby's thinking about running was muddled and slow. He was leaning against running most of the time. As he thought about it, Bobby, who had been the manager of his brother's winning presidential campaign, could see every detail of what could go wrong with his own. But he could not yet see what the election was going to be about: life and death. And so Bobby held history in his hands for so long that someone who could see what the election was going to be about decided he couldn't wait any longer and grabbed history out of Bobby's hands, someone no one expected to seize the moment until he did. And that decision by Gene McCarthy was the pebble that started running down the mountain that created this avalanche in American politics that year. There's much more to say about this. Many of you know much more about it than I do and lived through it, and I would love to hear from you in your questions or anything you might want to illuminate about this subject or anything else. And yes, Martin Sheen is a wicked nice guy. Yeah, so the question is, I think it's the question you hear a lot about Bobby. Wasn't he kind of a ruthless and non-liberal guy in the 1950s, and how did he get to be this liberal icon by the time he's running for president? And the answer is the 1960s. The part about the Roy Cohn section of Bobby's career, two things to know. It was very brief, and he despised Roy Cohn every moment of it. And so it was a period where basically the Kennedys were looking for a way for Bobby to fit into Washington. Jack was already there as an elected official, and so Bobby found his way into the Senate staff, and he was working on Joe McCarthy's committee, which he really didn't like, and he got out of that in less than 6 months. And then he went on to do a bunch of other things. What I trace in here is what happened to this country in the 1960s. Bobby Kennedy was not the same person in 1968 than he was in 1961, and no one in the country was. There were segregationists in 1961 who were not segregationists in 1968. When you look at what happened to people's opinions and their view of the world, Bobby Kennedy was someone who changed, I would say, an average amount for someone with their eyes open in that period of time. There were people who went through much more dramatic changes, much bigger pendulum swings in their lives than Bobby Kennedy did. And that's something I get into in depth about how the 60s changed everyone. Gene McCarthy and everyone else in the Senate, except for one senator, voted for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. That was the resolution President Johnson then used to wage full-fledged war. Gene McCarthy wanted that vote back a few years later. Gene McCarthy ended up running for president because Nick Katzenbach, who had been the hero of the integration of the University of Alabama when he was a deputy attorney general, it was Nicholas Katzenbach who was standing in the doorway steamrolling over Governor George Wallace to integrate that university. A couple of years later, he's an undersecretary of state, and he's testifying to the Foreign Relations Committee where Gene McCarthy's a member, and Nick Katzenbach says he believes declarations of war are outmoded, and that the president has all the authority he needs to wage war in Vietnam at any level he wants to, and there's nothing that Congress can say about it. And that was the moment. That was the hearing. That was the statement in that hearing that made Gene McCarthy walk out of the room, too angry to even speak about it and ask a question. And he said to his chief of staff when he got out into the hallway, if I have to run for president, I will, to stop what Lyndon Johnson is doing. So everyone knows about Bobby's resume is much more vivid in everyone's mind. So everybody knows that sort of, conservative or moderate, whatever you want to call it, Democrat Bobby was in the 50s, to the liberal Democrat. And there's all sorts of questions about what kind of opportunism was that? What was that? It was the kind of experience and enlightenment that people were going through in the 1960s. Before the assassination, summer of 1963, Bobby goes to North Dakota, which JFK lost and had no hope of ever winning. There was no conceivable political benefit for Bobby Kennedy to go to North Dakota for anything. And he went there to address a convention of Indian tribes that were meeting in North Dakota. And he delivers a speech to them in North Dakota that is a breathtaking piece, because if you read it, and if you stood up out at Standing Rock at the reservation where I was last summer during that demonstration, and if you read Bobby's speech, every word of it would be relevant to what they were doing there that day. And he actually quoted Chief Joseph, who gave a speech in 1877 about what Chief Joseph's hopes for the way the United States everyone here would be able to live together as one tribe under one sun and all that. So there's much in his evolution that's in here that I think clarifies that question, which I think is always the central biographical question about Bobby. And sorry that answer was so long. Please go ahead.
Okay. I'm intrigued by LBJ's decision not to run, and I think the conventional wisdom at the time was simply that he read the handwriting on the wall and he backed out. But even though he was only 60 years old, he was in pretty poor health. So I'm wondering whether, in your research, whether you were able to nail down what his ultimate plan really was, because it's been said that he expected that if he had been reelected, he never would have lived through a second term because of his health. And I don't even think he filed in New Hampshire. In fact, I think he won in a write-in, or he had some surrogate run in his place. So do you have any shedding light on that?
Yeah, in those days, incumbent presidents didn't file anywhere because there was no one was going to challenge them, so it wouldn't matter, what would happen. And so all the primary action would just be on the Republican side. You could ignore it. Lady Bird used to say that LBJ had his resignation letter in his pocket all the time, and every job he ever had. And he was kind of a quitter. He actually was. There were times when he was ready to give up on certain things early in his career, including the Senate campaign, and it was Lady Bird who actually was the strength that kept him in it. He dropped out because Bobby got in. He lived in fear of Bobby Kennedy, hated him, and I don't use that word lightly. People throw it around with politicians. It's very rare for one politician to actually hate the other. They each said enough that you can safely say they each hated each other. But Lyndon lived in complete fear of Bobby, and Bobby never lived in fear of Lyndon. And so he saw what McCarthy did in New Hampshire. It shocked him. And Lyndon understood better than anybody what that weakness meant. And then Bobby jumps in, and he simply could not see how he could successfully campaign against Bobby. And Jack Newfield had a brilliant theory at the time. And Jack Newfield was a Village Voice columnist. And he said to Bobby privately, he was the only one who said to Bobby, I think if you get in, Johnson will drop out. And this will be a reference that people of a certain age will get. He said, I think LBJ is Sonny Liston. And, Sonny Liston was the most fearsome heavyweight champion of all time until he simply sat on the stool at the end of a round and refused to go back in the ring against Cassius Clay, who, after winning the championship, changed his name to Muhammad Ali. And so he said that he's Sonny Liston. He's just going to quit. And Jack Newfield was completely right. Anybody else? So the question was, can you draw any comparison between Senator Jeff Flake's and Senator Bob Corker's decisions not to run for the Senate for re-election this year? Having worked in the Senate, there is exactly one decision that I always understand, and that's the decision not to run for re-election. It's the decision to run for re-election that you've got to explain to me. If you're a junior senator like Jeff Flake, now once you've got a chairmanship, you've got a reason to go to work. But before you have that, I could spend most of my time describing the powerlessness of the job. Once you throw in all this crazy static frustration that surrounds the lives of a Republican senator, that job is just not worth what you think it is. The guys who are running for re-election are the ones who've got to explain something to me. I don't get that.
I was just thinking, I was in graduate school at the University of Chicago in 1968, so in the thick of much of this stuff, and I was just thinking that 1968 for me and for many of us, I dare say, is kind of like having a sore tooth. You know that it hurts a lot, but somehow you can't stay away from it.
Right.
And I wonder if you would comment some on the violence. A lot of the, some of the weathermen were in graduate school with me. I don't know that they really got going in '68, but that was the nub of it. And I was very sympathetic with the demonstrators at the Democratic Convention, except I'd lived in Chicago long enough to know that it would be a bloodbath and didn't go. But so I wonder, what do you see as the effect of the violence, the protests? I tend to see them more positive, but they also turned a lot of people off.
Well, there was a commission was convened to study the riots at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, and it was a bipartisan commission of the kinds of people in those days who were always on those commissions. And they reached a very clear conclusion. They called it a police riot. They said that, yes, the protesters were out there and they moved into restricted spaces that they weren't supposed to move into, but all of the reaction by the Chicago police was overreaction. They were beating people who were sitting in restaurants. They were beating people inside of the doorways of hotels. They were beating people who were very legally assembled on sidewalks. They were beating delegates who were trying to walk back to their hotels. They were completely out of control, and that was documented to the point where it's beyond argument. The violence was something that many of the protesters wanted to see, because they wanted this violence to, they believed, teach a lesson to America about the way this country really was. They perceived the country as a police state, and they believed that this kind of imagery would actually help deliver that message. Most of the people there who were the victims of that rioting did not think that. Most of them were clean for Gene kids who were not violent in the least and didn't want violence. McCarthy himself was horrified by it. He felt guilty. He felt that he lured these kids up to New Hampshire. They all shaved their hair and their beards and got clean for Gene, and now they were getting, beaten horribly on the streets of Chicago, all because of him. He felt it very, very personally. He opened up the McCarthy hotel rooms in the Hilton that night to basically use as a first aid center, and brought them in and walked around it himself as if a general, visiting the wounded troops in the middle of a battle. Humphrey was up in his suite, waiting to see his nomination moment where he goes over the top, and the networks cut from the nomination process to the violence in the streets, and so Humphrey never got that moment on TV. And just before that happened, the people in the Humphrey suite, the World War II veterans, which included Humphrey, they all recognized, there was a smell they all recognized coming through the ventilation system. It was tear gas. They were smelling the tear gas in the Humphrey suite. But that's the closest the Humphrey world ever came to what was actually happening down on the streets. And the next day, Gene McCarthy never addressed the convention. He never went to the convention hall. But the next day, he went out into Grant Park, where all the wounded demonstrators were, and he addressed them as what he called the government of the people in exile.
Well, since you brought it up, my other question was going to be, I'm sorry.
I think we have to go to another one.
Gene McCarthy versus, when Bobby Kennedy declared, it was kind of unfair.
Yeah. At that point, I, as a kid when I was watching it, it just looked opportunistic to me when Bobby Kennedy jumped in, and yet at the same time I had this romanticism about the Kennedys, and so I was torn about who to cheer for. Now I know there was a lot more to it than that. Gene McCarthy wanted Bobby Kennedy to run instead of him. And Allard Lowenstein was going around trying to get any Democrat to be the candidate to dump Johnson. And, they'd go to Bobby Kennedy. He'd think about it, and then he'd say no. And then they would go to Gene McCarthy. He would say no right away. And Gene would say, you should ask George McGovern. They'd go ask George McGovern. McGovern would say, you should ask Gene McCarthy. And this went on for months. And so Bobby was much more active in the brewing of what this campaign became than I realized. This wasn't a decision made immediately upon seeing the returns in New Hampshire.
Hi, Lawrence. I wanted to get your opinion on a current event with Judge Roy Moore. I'm wondering if you think he will win if he stays in the race, and also what's your reaction to what Steve Bannon said in reaction to the situation, that the media, specifically the Washington Post, is the opposition party? This is an example of why they're the opposition party.
Well, if Steve Bannon said it, it must be right. So we'll just have to take his word for it. Well, look, as it stands tonight, it's one of those things that's pretty fast moving, but there's a kind of a flash poll that's out in Alabama tonight after 24 hours of this that shows the two candidates tied now. So that's a pretty big drop for Roy Moore. I don't have any predictions for things that are still kind of hot live news events. I don't know what's going to happen next. I certainly have never before predicted the outcome of an election in Alabama. I've never thought about it. And here's how much I know about it. When I was serving in the Senate, both of the senators from Alabama were Democrats. Okay, so what do I know about the current life in Alabama?
Yeah, I asked the question because they can't take his name off the ballot.
Right, they can't, but you can do the write-in, and that's how Lisa Murkowski held on to her seat in Alaska, was a write-in. So write-ins work. And as I discovered in researching this book, LBJ won New Hampshire as a write-in candidate because, as you said, they didn't even bother to put him on the ballot. There wasn't supposed to be a contest.
Hi, thanks. I'm going to try to abbreviate this here as quickly as possible. I want to try to get comments from you on an analogy between the political divide in 1968 and the political divide today. As a previous speaker, I was a graduate student in the 1968 election period with a low draft number, and so military policy and foreign policy were a really important thing to me for personal reasons as well as kind of philosophical reasons. And but today things are different because we don't have a lottery, we don't have a draft. And yet we do have a divide, and we have a divide between a part of the population that is, in some sense, vulnerable to, for economic reasons, vulnerable to sort of the risk of military service versus maybe elites who are not quite so vulnerable to that risk. Am I trying to make too much of the importance of military and foreign policy because of Americans' involvement not only in the part of the younger part of the electorate, but their parents and so forth? Can you comment on what things were like then compared to what they're like now for young people and for their parents?
Yeah, it's a great question. Every kid in high school was a foreign policy expert, and those were the days when a high school student like me could think that he was smarter than the President of the United States and smarter than the Secretary of State, and be right. Right. And boy, I mean, it was an amazing time, and it was because of the way the Vietnam War was fought, the order of magnitude of the Vietnam War. We haven't seen anything like it since. I just want to glance at the numbers. 1968 alone, just 1968 alone, 16,589 military funerals in this country. My cousin Johnny was just one of them. Okay, 16,589 in 1 year. Iraq, the entire 16 years there, 4,497. Afghanistan, the entire, 16, 17 years, 2,386. So the total combined 21st century war dead for the United States in Afghanistan, in Iraq, is less than half of 1968, of 1 year of the Vietnam War. And so that scale changes everything. And of course, you can only get those Vietnam numbers with the draft, as you were just talking about. So every 18-year-old got that draft card, and he immediately became a foreign policy expert, immediately had an opinion about all of this. And most of us had an opinion about that before that time, because everyone was threatened. Everyone was threatened. Your boyfriend was threatened, that meant you were threatened. Your brother was threatened, that meant you were threatened. You know, your nephew was threatened, your grandson, that meant you were threatened. Women were not immune from this. Mothers, sisters were not immune from this. And so every family was threatened by this. You had dear friends who were threatened by this, and it determined the way we thought about not just our politics and policy, but our lives. And I wasn't intending to do this, but I want to read you a passage of this book that is relevant to this. And since you know who won, I won't be giving anything away. I'm going to read you what is actually the last couple of pages of the book. It's the epilogue. I'm not giving away any plot here, okay? None. It's all going to be a surprise. And one of the things I get to in the epilogue is this question of the what ifs. You know, what if Bobby didn't run? What if Gene didn't run? What if Teddy Kennedy accepted Gene McCarthy's offer to give him all of his delegates in Chicago and tried to get the nomination for Teddy Kennedy, the secret offer of the secret plan that was alive for almost 24 hours before it collapsed? What if that had happened? What if Bobby Kennedy had left the stage in Los Angeles on the other side, the side he was supposed to leave on, instead of the side toward the kitchen? You can go on and on with this forever, but I just want to read you this part because it touches on this question. The biggest what if of all is, what if Eugene McCarthy had not run? What if Nicholas Katzenbach had not provoked Senator McCarthy with his testimony about the president's unlimited power to wage war in Southeast Asia without a declaration of war? What if Al Lowenstein had not urged McCarthy to run? If Gene McCarthy had not run, Bobby Kennedy would not have run and would not have been assassinated on the night of the California primary. President Johnson would have run for re-election. Election night would have come down to Johnson versus Nixon. No matter what the outcome, Bobby Kennedy surely would have run for president as the anti-war candidate in 1972. And then, but Gene McCarthy did run. He made the bravest decision of any candidate in 1968, a decision that changed his party, changed the campaign, changed the anti-war movement into an important faction of the Democratic Party, and changed the course of history. The most important thing Gene McCarthy did in 1968 was save lives. We have no idea when the Vietnam War would have ended if Gene McCarthy hadn't made the ending the war a presidential campaign issue in 1968. The war ended 7 years after McCarthy ran. If the first anti-war presidential candidate did not run until 1972, would the war have ended 7 years later, in 1979? We don't know. The peace movement won. The peace movement drove U.S. forces out of Vietnam, not the North Vietnamese army. American politics responds slowly to protests, so it took several years for the peace movement to win. Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger complained for the rest of their lives that they were not able to achieve peace with honor in Vietnam because congressional support for the war kept dropping. That is a complaint about democracy. More and more members of Congress turned against the war because the peace movement, their voters, forced them to turn against the war. The Nixon-Ford administration would not have declared an end to the war in 1975 if the peace movement hadn't forced them to. The last man to die for a mistake would not have been killed in Vietnam on April 29, 1975. Would that man have been killed in 1976? In 77? 78? 79? How many more would have died? The millions of men and women who were active in the peace movement saved lives by forcing the war to end sooner than it would have if they hadn't taken to the streets in protest, something most of them had never done before for anything. Martin Luther King Jr. saved lives by raising his singular voice against the war. Bobby Kennedy saved lives by adding his anti-war voice to the growing chorus that when it was still a politically risky choice. Al Lowenstein, Tom Hayden, John Kerry, and other leaders of the anti-war movement saved lives. Jean's wife, Abigail McCarthy, and their daughter, Mary, saved lives. There are thousands of Americans who owe their lives to people who forced the United States to get out of Vietnam on April 30th, 1975. I received a draft notice in December 1972. I was in college. 2 weeks later, I had to report for my physical exam at an Army facility in South Boston. The place was filled with young men standing in line for their physicals. Some had doctor's letters they hoped would disqualify them. Others were going to pretend to be gay or mentally ill to get disqualified. I passed the physical and went home to wait for my induction notice to arrive in the mail telling me exactly when to report for duty. Then, about a week before my induction notice was supposed to arrive, President Nixon ended the draft on January 27th, 1973. If Gene McCarthy had not run for president in 1968, the draft would not have ended in 1973. None of the young men I saw at the induction center that day were killed in Vietnam because the political pressure of the anti-war movement forced Nixon to end the draft. Many of the young men I saw at the induction center went on to have children and grandchildren who don't know that they owe their lives to the people who stopped the draft and the war. There are thousands of families living in Vietnam today who wouldn't be there if the war had continued for another year or 2 or 3. The last word about Gene McCarthy should always be that no one did more to stop the killing in Vietnam than Senator Eugene McCarthy. If I have to run for president to do it, I'm going to do it. Senator Eugene McCarthy, August 17th, 1967.
This question is about Gene McCarthy and his counterpart, Bernie Sanders, who you pointed out is our modern version. I was one of those people who went door to door for Gene McCarthy. And like young people today who've gone door to door for Bernie Sanders. And he's also opened up the protests and the possibilities for the future that for young people. And we see what happens in Virginia as a result of the Women's March and as a result of what Bernie did. So in the same way that you have so much accolades for Gene McCarthy, my question is, why doesn't MSNBC and other mainstream news stations cover the alternatives to the establishment point of view? And Virginia took everybody by surprise. And these were all first-time candidates who were inspired by this new wave. So, that's what I hope for when I listen to the news. And we love your show. But I just would like to hear that other voice coming in.
Is the other voice Bernie?
No, well, it is Bernie. I love to hear Bernie.
Right,
but
so
I also want to hear about down county elections. I don't want to just hear about the two candidates for governor or senator or whatever. There's a whole lot of other stuff going on that we never hear about.
Right. Okay. So the party establishment, as this book shows, is always the last to know when something new and important is happening in a party. That was true in the Democratic Party in 1968. It was true in the Democratic Party this last time around. It was true in the Republican Party this last time around. None of them saw Trump and Trumpism coming. So the establishment of the party is always going to behave that way. There's nothing new about that. They'll be behaving that way 20 years from now. They'll be the last to recognize any new and important phenomenon. as to exactly, where we point the cameras in network television, that's such a complicated question. I'm just going to leave you with this one note about how much Bernie coverage 10 p.m. has at MSNBC. As far as I know, we did a reasonable and fair amount of sharing that coverage between the Clinton and the Sanders campaign. But Bernie Sanders, to this day, has never once accepted an invitation to come on my show. So if you'd like to see him there, I'm not the person to ask about that. I don't know if it's the 10 p.m. thing. When I'm his age, I'm not going to be doing this at 10 p.m. I guarantee you. I don't know. At the same time, Hillary Clinton's never accepted an invitation to appear on MSNBC at 10 p.m. either. But that didn't stop Twitter from every night during the Democratic campaign accuse me in equal amounts of being completely pro-Bernie and hateful of Hillary, and completely pro-Hillary and hateful of Bernie. There was no conceivable way for me to cover that and get any other reviews. There's one more. There's one more question behind you there.
Hi there, thank you for coming. I was wondering, in 1968 and throughout the Vietnam War, the American people in a generation lost faith in the institutions of government. And now this generation of Americans, my generation of Americans, also have no faith. And that was even before Trump. So how do people build trust in institutions that want to strip the rights away from transgender people, from people of color, from people that aren't white men that control everything in the government? So how can this book tell us that trust is restored with institutions of power?
Well, because I was a high school kid in 1968 and smarter than the president and the Secretary of State, I have never once, ever used the word trust in relation to this government. It's not a concept that I believe the government is worthy of. It is not a concept that the Founding Fathers thought should ever apply to government or the people who run it. They certainly didn't trust government, and they certainly didn't trust the people who were going to end up in it. That's why they put every check and balance they could think of everywhere they could think of it. And so we have a government that has to prove itself to us every day. There was a kind of trust in government prior to, say, 1966. The first draft card burnings, I think, were 64 or 65. And by the way, it was not a crime to burn your draft card the first time draft cards were burned, because no one in the government had ever thought anyone would ever do that. So they had to write it as a crime in 1965, for which you could get 2 years or 6 years and all that. But it was a crime if you didn't have your draft card on your person. You had to have it on your person at all times. And so that's when the first institution to collapse was the Defense Department. By 1968, the trust, and there was trust, in the Defense Department and the military collapsed completely. And the kind of fealty and worship that the generals of the Trump White House want was a laughable concept in 1968. Generals were being burned in effigy at peace marches. We knew all their names, the guys who were running the war in Vietnam. We believed they were all incompetent. None of us knew anything about the military, and it turns out we were all right. And so I don't think you should trust. Alex and I worked in the Senate. I don't think you should trust the Senate. I don't think you should trust senators. I think it's nice if you don't insult them and say nasty things to them. But I would say that's true of everyone you see on the bus today. It's just not. Just don't do it. But there's trust is the biggest mistake I think you can make with government. Make them earn it. That's why we have elections as frequently as we do. The press doesn't trust government, and that's the best thing about the press. The press should not trust government, shouldn't trust the people who populate it. We have to live with it. When the Supreme Court issues an opinion, we have to live with it. We don't have to respect it. We don't have to trust it. They've been horribly wrong in the past, and they will be horribly wrong in the future. And so I think this notion of trusting government is a kind of fantasy and by the way, when I say fantasy, it's everywhere. It's all across the media. I mean, everything I'm saying is a general heresy in the American media right now. I mean, you'll hear that all the time. Oh, what happened to trust in government? You know, as though it's some wonderful thing had been lost somewhere along the line. You know, and do you mean trust the government? Let's say in I don't know, 68, when there was no such thing as a campaign finance law? None, zero. You could take bags of cash. That was legal. Is that the government you want to trust? I don't think so. And so it's a romantic notion about us being able to relinquish all the energy it takes to police government as citizens and just say, now I trust it. Don't do that.